I have so many mixed feelings about this picture. This was the building we lived in. My life before Robert, I would say, was a regular textbook family. All three of us, me, my mom, and my sister, were always super close. I was old enough to understand that my dad, who was in the Air Force, was out of the country, and he had been gone for a while, and she was lonely. I'm sure she was lonely until Robert came in the picture, and things took a big turn. This is a picture of my mom and Robert soon after they started dating. My mom met him. She went out with one of our neighbors to the local officers club, the NCO club on base. When I found this picture, even my mom doesn't look happy in this picture. I feel during the time my dad was gone, my mom really didn't know what to do. This was her first time with two little kids on her own. And I think that she just thought it'd be easier if she had somebody else to help her with everything. The first time I met Robert, I was 7, getting ready to have my 8th birthday. It was kind of exciting at first. This was the Robert that we had in his off time, when he wasn't thinking he was playing G.I. Joe, Rambo in the Air Force. He worked in the military police. He was a big guy. He always seemed so big to me. And he always had his camis on and his camouflage hat with a beer and a koozie. That was his outside of work uniform, always. We initially thought it was a cool idea if he would have really been that way, you know? I'd say that wore off within the first 6 months. I would say their relationship moved rather quickly. He would just come on the weekends or, you know, a couple days. But when he started being there all the time, it was so overwhelming for me. So overwhelming. He had set up a target in our basement, and he would shoot our Barbies that we no longer played with, or dolls we didn't play with anymore. He had a blast doing that, which I thought was very, very weird. In our basement, he had a seat on the couch that was just where he sat. We had a coffee table that all his guns and all his cleaning products to clean them were always right there. He didn't need to have guns. And I think that was his backbone. It was more of him showing the power behind them and what he had, honestly. I had never been around that, so it was kind of scary to me. One day, I come in, open the door, drop my stuff, and run to the bathroom. And right before I could pull my pants down, the shower curtain flies open. And he's standing there with a gas mask and a machete. He thought it was the funniest thing that I peed my pants. I felt like I was on eggshells all the time. I didn't know what was gonna happen. He just kind of took over, and my mom let him. Like, I guess the man's supposed to control the house, so that's how she felt about it. I just wanted to not worry and not be anxious all the time and just be a kid. I just did not trust him. You know, I was always waiting for something to happen, and I guess now we really have to follow his rules. Whenever we asked for something, he would have us drop and do push-ups for whatever we wanted. You want to go roller skating? 30 push-ups. You know, it started being whatever we asked, we had to do push-ups. So, yeah, I quit asking for anything. I mean, because there would be any time he would just be like, give me 20 push-ups, or, you know, just sitting there, and he'd tell us to count them off. It was all him establishing dominance over me. He was taking control and seeing what he could get away with. Robert, along with many other things, implemented that I wash dishes now. I was 8 years old, couldn't even reach in the sink yet. And there was a time where I had did the dishes the night before, and Robert came and woke me up from bed. It wasn't time to get up for school yet. He pointed out a plate that still had crusty stuff on it and told me that I was to hold the plate to the wall with my nose until he told me I was done. He told me if I dropped that plate, I would pay for it. The whole time I'm just sitting there thinking, like, what's next? And just try not to cry because there was nothing I could do about it. Absolutely nothing. It was my life. I'm just thinking, like, what is the point of this? You know, the anxiety and the fear and everything that I was already feeling, I felt was enough punishment. I must have been standing there 30, 45 minutes. And he finally said I could move.
Okay, that's enough.
This is a picture of my sister and I with my puppy Buster that I had received on my birthday. When I got Buster, he was mine and nobody could take him from me, not even Robert. My mom gave him to me and he was mine, you know. But when Robert came home and found Buster, he was mad. He voices his anger and he wasn't gonna do anything for him. It was me and my mom's job to take care of him. And we did. I was running all over the house looking for him.
Buster?
Like, where's Buster?
Buster?
I already had all these things in my mind. Like, did Robert do something to him? He didn't like him from the beginning, so what's stopping him from doing it? And Robert's just sitting on the couch. He just blatant, like he was so proud of himself, was like, if you really want to know what I did to Buster, I broke his neck and threw him in the garbage. And I just ran up to my room. I cried the whole night. I was so messed up at that time. I just didn't even know what to do. I didn't know who to talk to. I'm like, this is not good. And that was always in my head, always in my head. If somebody could kill a dog, they could definitely kill a person. And I didn't know if that was gonna be me. This was our baby Rocky. Right before he went and got Rocky is when he told me what he did to Buster. It was just like a couple months before that. And I thought, well, maybe he's trying to make it right. He was such a good dog, though. But just like everything else, Robert had to tear it away from us because he couldn't control him. I remember the day that he broke his 4x4 run. Robert ran over there and took him by his chain that he was dragging and flung him around like a helicopter in the air. It was terrifying to hear the noises coming out of Rocky and to see a human being doing that. And he had to shoot him 5 times because he just wouldn't die. I want to know why he ever kept getting dogs. When you know you're just going to take them away from us, why even do that? Why? Was that fulfilling your need of killing something? The day he did that, I wouldn't even look at Robert. I just kept staring at my mom, just like, are you going to open your mouth? Why is this okay? Hello, lady. You know, do you see what's happening here? And I just kept looking at her like, and just no response, nothing. And I just think she was afraid if she would have said something. He controlled all of us. He did it because he wanted to, and he got a thrill from it. And after Rocky was killed, I definitely had the thought in my head that nobody's safe. He wore the belt to work every day. That seemed to be his go-to, you know? Well, you can always get the belt, you know? The one time I got the belt, that was the first time. I didn't make it home before the streetlights came on. I was actually like 30 minutes late. I had marks for days, thick leather marks for days. And that was just for coming home late. He had no problem whooping me. And that's when the paddle, my cutting board, came into play. I was like so excited, so I made her a cutting board because I cut it out myself and I'd sanded it for weeks and put the finish on it. And I was so excited to give it to her. And I came home and handed it to her, and Robert grabbed it. And he said, you know, this would be perfect for a paddle. And like my heart dropped. I was so disappointed because I knew he was gonna do what he was saying, you know, and he went and cut the sides off. I was crying. I was also crying because I seen what he made with it. And I knew that was not going to be anything nice. So it always became a choice between the paddle that he made out of my cutting board or his military belt, which was like thick leather. And I had already felt that, so I thought maybe the paddle would be better. I always chose the paddle. I don't know why, but I did. It was a big deal to me because then he took what I made and used it against me. And that's when he started the whoopings. It was a part of the grooming. I believe he was trying to see what he could do, what he could just push the limit far enough. My mom won't say anything. He could get away with it. And it was just always just a little bit more each time. He would ask me to rub his back. So, you know, I'd have to go around on the couch and rub his back, which was fine because my mom was right there and we were on the couch. But then it started escalating to he'd lay in the bed and he would just have a towel over his butt. We'd get up to get ready for school and he would just say, "Hey, I need my back massaged." And normally it would be after my mom already left for work. So she wouldn't really know until she got home and she's like, "Why aren't you at school?" But even then, I don't think she questioned him. I don't understand why my mom thinks this is normal, you know, but nobody wanted to anger the bear. Nobody wanted to see what would happen if they said no. When I was sleeping, all of a sudden, I would just be woke up to him up my shirt or down my pants and just the smell of beer. But he would come in there it was a lot. I try to make myself, I started layering. I would wear like 4 tank tops and then a shirt. You know what I'm like? If he can't get through all the layers, he can't touch me, was my thinking then. But I'd also normally cry myself to sleep because I couldn't believe I was having to go through that. I finally was able to tell my mom about it. She said she talked to him, and it stopped for a minute. And I'm like, wow, thanks for talking to him, Mom. But then it started back up again. And there was one opportunity where I told her, well, he's doing it again. And she's like, what? And I said, what do you want me to do? Like, I would really like to just be a kid. And she's like, well, why don't we just pick up a lock? And we bought one of them slide chain locks. I couldn't wait to go to bed and lock the door because I was gonna sleep that night. You know, I was excited. I'm not gonna be bothered. I get to sleep. My mom did something. And I woke up immediately as soon as I heard that doorknob. He tried it, and he couldn't get in. And then I could hear him with my mom, like, what did you do? What did you do? I'm just laying there just thinking, like, is that the conversation we're having right now? I guess, you know. But I'm safe. He didn't get in here tonight. I believe at the time when my mom put the lock on the door, she was brave enough to finally tell him to get out. was finally stepping up for herself. Sometimes I just wonder if she even had a clue what to do. One day, I just noticed like it was a big gash in her back. And then like a mark over it, and it was big, you know? And I'm like, what happened to your back? And she's like, oh, I fell into the bedside table. Even at that age, I was telling her there's no excuse for him to put his hands on you. You know, it's bad enough, like the mind control and everything, and now he's touching, putting his hands on you. No. I feel it goes back to the grooming, the predatory behavior, seeking out people that you can manipulate and control. And I think that most narcissists, they go for people. They see people, they notice people that they can influence and engage in and control. They pick up on that so easily, and I think he probably picked up on that. My mom was so small and petite compared to him, and I think he took advantage of that. He knew that he can control her. I would ask her, why can't we just leave? Because she was always afraid of him. So if you can't make him leave, why can't we leave? I know that there had to be brainwashing, and it was just fear. But then I did start thinking about what he might be doing to her. We were sitting watching TV one day after school, and he was cleaning his guns like he normally did. My mom was cooking dinner, so she really was oblivious to anything that was happening. And he pulled the gun on me. He said, I could just shoot you right now. And what would you do?
Hey.
And I just kind of stared at him. I was stunned, and I didn't really know how to respond. I'm sure my face probably said it all, and I think that gave him the gratification he wanted. And he just started going back into cleaning it again, like nothing just happened. And that was the first time that it happened where he actually pointed the gun at me. We were at my cousin's house visiting. We were in Robert's parents' conversion van, and my mom had to run up to the corner store.
I'll be right back, okay?
And then he turns around and started arguing with me with something that I don't remember what we were arguing about, but he was like, you know, I could just kill you. And just pulled his gun out from under the seat and just held it to my head. I always remember his expression. I always remember his face. He was very straight-faced and very serious. And I knew it, but I just didn't care anymore. And then, I see my mom in the rearview mirror walking up, and I thought I'd probably be better off if he just pulled it. Then I wouldn't have to deal with it anymore. None of the bull, none of it. Not worrying about what's gonna happen to me, what he's gonna do, or, then maybe he'll get in trouble. I was like, just do it. Just do it. You'll have a lot to explain to my mom. Just pull it. He intended to shoot me that day. Something just happened and I was done. And I wasn't gonna let him do his dumb he had been doing to me for all them years, and I was gonna talk back and fight back. And he slid it back on the seat. And I think about that all the time. Like, what if he would have did it? A cyclist charged in fatal I-270 crash. A Columbus man is charged with drunken driving after a passenger on his motorcycle died as a result of injuries he sustained in an accident. The driver of the motorcycle, Robert Cordell, 32, was driving at a high rate of speed and lost control of the motorcycle. Both men had been drinking at the time, and the investigation continues. This was an accident that my mom had actually been waiting to happen because he told her he had planned this. Their marriage was dissolving, so things started, taking different turns, meeting different people he wanted to bring around. Robert started having an affair with his friend's wife. He would brag to my mom that he was gonna take care of him, get him out of the picture, and did exactly like he told her. He was gonna get him as drunk as he could. He was gonna put him on the back of his bike, and he was gonna drive as fast as he could till he flew off. And that's exactly what he did. When we seen it on the news and in the paper, her jaw dropped when we seen it, and he actually did it. I don't know why she would ever think he wouldn't. I mean, he was pretty good with following through with threats. It was heartbreaking that his family did not know how evil Robert was and actually fought for him not to do jail time. They won. He did no jail time for this. I believe that he murdered his best friend. It's just the lowest of the low. I'm sure there was fear and despair. My mom just really couldn't handle it, and she was over it. And I think she needed that. She just was fed up, and she gained her footing. My mom finally had the courage to leave. I was happy that she was divorcing him, just making him go. And she made him go. We didn't leave. She made him go. At least when he wasn't there, I could breathe. I felt like I could breathe. I could fully expand my lungs and I could breathe. The day she went to court, I told her come pick me up from school early, and we went out and celebrated. But she was scared. She was so scared then. And I think she was afraid of him stalking, which he did. Robert kept calling over and over again and leaving messages on the answer machine that he was on his way over there to kill her. And he was gonna do to her like he did to his friend. And we all know how that turned out, is what he said. It was just constant. He was calling back to back, to back, to back, and just kept leaving messages. I believe he was very capable of following through with every threat. Probably wouldn't have a second thought about killing me or my mom. Wouldn't even bother them. When he was gone, I would still feel the anxiousness. I think that I won't truly feel like calm in my heart until he's dead, until I know he's gone. Around 2002, we had just moved. My mom was in a new place, and we're settling, and the phone rings, and it's a lawyer. And she asked what it's referring to, and they said Robert Cordell. And I'm like, what? And I guess he was explaining to her what happened.
Prosecutors say Cordell shot and killed his neighbor, former Reading Mayor Frank Carnavelli, his ex-wife Rita Bushman, and Cordell's former sister-in-law, Kathy Cordell.
Yesterday afternoon, police say he had blood on his boots and eventually admitted killing his neighbors, and then told police his sister-in-law was also dead inside the home.
None of us were surprised. It blew our mind that he did that, but we weren't surprised. He's 100% a monster and a predator and a killer.
Victim's family was also in court to face the man they say turned on friends.
Just came over and killed my brother and his wife for no reason.
It just don't make sense why somebody would hurt somebody that did so much for him.
I learned that he strangled his sister-in-law, and I can't believe he was in the house with her for a day or two, and went next door and confronted the neighbor about wanting his vehicle back, and proceeded to shoot him 12 times. And when his ex-wife came to check out what happened, he shot her. It wasn't unexpected. We 100% thought we'd see something else sooner than this. I just think about his sister-in-law. He had to stare her in the eyes while he was doing this. That's very personal, to strangle somebody. Honestly, none of us would have been surprised if there was other victims. There's probably other victims. People that he took advantage of didn't have people. The grooming mentality of trying to be around people that didn't have anybody protect them, look out for them. And I think about that a lot too, because I think, anytime he came in my room, he could have just decided to get rid of me too. I knew too much, I could get him in trouble. And then it just makes me think of the guns to my head, and he could have killed me 2 times then. He actually looks very small. He looks like he's defeated. And I like that. He needs to be defeated. He needs to be brought down to the level he belongs, which is under my feet. And that's the first time he looks like that. I believe he should have been given the death penalty, and I would have loved to seen that day. I don't think that taxpayers should pay for him to breathe and to eat and to live. He's a waste of space. I would actually like, when he dies, can they send me a video of him being pushed into the oven? I am so serious. That would be the best closure for a lot of people. My mom was diagnosed with lung cancer in the summer of 2018. And even though she went through treatment and was doing well, it still took her life in 2020 during COVID. If my mom was here for this, I believe that she would be very supportive. And I think she'd probably be proud of me. It's kind of like the end of the chapter, closing the book. I wish she would have had the strength to leave earlier. I wish she would have known what to do. I think just at her age and in the life she lived, she really didn't know her options, and she didn't have anybody to talk to about that either. And she just picked what she thought was the best route for her. And as much as I paid for her being with him, she paid. I've closed my book on all the trauma. I've worked through the trauma. It's just made me the person I am today. I don't deal with anybody's bull. I'm always the one to stand up. If I wouldn't have lived the life I lived with him, I probably would have been a different person. My experiences have made me who I am today. I'm not gonna thank him for that. He should die for that. But I am the person I am. Everything has built me up to this.
What would you say to Robert if you were sitting in the same room with him today?
I would say, if I seen Robert today, you didn't get me. I won. I'm still here. I'm walking this earth. I'm breathing this air free. And I'm not only free to do it, I'm free from you to do it. And I'm good, and I made a life. And I didn't let anything you do take that from me. Anything you did, I still did everything. Just made me do it better. I could have went down his path and ended up crazy and let everything that affected me drive me crazy and do crazy things. But it's my mind. So I chose that I was gonna heal from it. And I wasn't gonna let it break me like it did when I was that age. I've done pretty good.
I make a comment, he angers like that. The next thing I know, he's got his hands around me, choking me.
It was real then, that he was a murderer.
Deep in the immense, seemingly boundless expanse of the South Pacific Ocean lies American Samoa, a remote territory characterized by lush volcanic landscapes, deep harbors, and a profound fundamental geographical isolation. Situated thousands of miles away from the mainland United States, this island territory exists in a highly specific, almost paradoxical administrative and economic space. It is legally American soil, governed under the flag of the United States, yet it remains profoundly distant from the direct, daily scrutiny of federal oversight agencies in Washington or the bustling, heavily regulated commercial hubs of the mainland. This distance, both physical and administrative, creates a persistent shadow zone. It is a place where the stringent labor laws, intense regulatory enforcement, and human rights protections inherent to the mainland can sometimes become distorted, delayed, or entirely ignored by those possessing malicious intent and sufficient capital. It was precisely this unique combination of geographical isolation and legal ambiguity that laid the crucial groundwork for one of the most egregious, systematic cases of human exploitation and modern slavery in the history of American jurisdiction. For the corporate world, the island offered a highly coveted, lucrative prize: the ability to manufacture products that legally bore the prestigious origin label of the United States. Any garment stitched, pressed, and packaged on this remote island could be shipped directly into the massive, insatiable mainland consumer market without facing the heavy import tariffs, strict quotas, and rigorous inspections that typically restrict foreign-made textile products. For an unscrupulous operator looking to maximize profit margins at the expense of human dignity, American Samoa was not perceived as a beautiful tropical haven, but rather as a perfectly constructed, natural fortress for unchecked, industrial-scale exploitation. In the latter months of 1998, an opportunistic Korean businessman named Kil-Soo Lee recognized the dark, untapped potential of this island territory. His attention settled on a struggling garment manufacturing facility located within the sprawling, deteriorating Old Daewoo corporate complex in a quiet western village of Pago Pago, the capital of American Samoa. The factory was steadily failing under its previous management, struggling to maintain profitability in a competitive global market. However, Kil-Soo Lee did not acquire this failing enterprise with the intention of building a legitimate, thriving, ethical business. His acquisition was a coldly calculated, predatory move to secure a base of operations that provided the immense economic benefits of American origin labeling while operating completely outside the protective, watchful gaze of mainland authorities. Lee understood intimately that to maximize his profit margins to an extreme, unprecedented degree, he could absolutely not rely on the local Samoan workforce. Local workers had deep roots in the community, extensive family networks, and an inherent understanding of their fundamental rights and avenues for legal recourse. To execute his grand vision of a hyper-profitable, essentially cost-free manufacturing empire, he required a workforce that was entirely vulnerable, entirely dependent, and completely severed from any social, familial, or legal support system. He needed laborers who could be easily isolated, silenced, and controlled through systemic intimidation. To achieve this sinister objective, Lee turned his attention back across the Pacific toward Asia, specifically targeting the economically vulnerable, structurally disadvantaged populations in rural areas of Vietnam and China. He did not travel to recruit these workers directly, thereby keeping his own hands seemingly clean in the initial phases of the deception. Instead, he established and utilized a sophisticated transnational network of labor export brokers and recruitment agencies. These brokers operated as his willing proxies, venturing deep into impoverished provinces and working-class neighborhoods to peddle a carefully constructed, highly manipulative illusion. They aggressively sold the ultimate narrative of prosperity, upward mobility, and financial salvation, promising desperate families guaranteed access to secure, high-paying jobs on official American territory. The brokers painted vivid, irresistible pictures of substantial monthly salaries, guaranteed uninterrupted employment for a full 3-year term, and the unprecedented opportunity to send enough foreign currency back home to completely transform the financial standing of their entire extended families. For many individuals living under the crushing weight of systemic poverty, this proposition was not interpreted merely as a standard job offer. It was viewed as a miraculous lifeline, a singular once-in-a-lifetime chance to secure a stable future for their aging parents, struggling siblings, and young children. The narrative was meticulously, cynically designed to exploit their deepest hopes and familial devotions, intentionally blinding the prospective workers to the harsh geographical realities of American Samoa and the hidden, devastating dangers lurking within the complex contracts they were aggressively pressured to sign. The ultimate victims of this elaborate transnational deception were overwhelmingly disproportionately young women. Out of the more than 250 individual workers eventually ensnared in Kil-Soo Lee's massive operation, the vast majority were young female laborers drafted from the rural provinces of Vietnam, accompanied by a smaller, similarly vulnerable cohort of roughly 25 workers sourced from China. These specific women were chosen precisely for their perceived social docility, their lack of familiarity with international labor laws, and most crucially, their deep-seated, culturally ingrained obligations to sacrifice their own well-being for the financial survival of their families. They were individuals fully willing to endure immense personal hardship, long hours, and physical exhaustion to provide basic necessities for their loved ones. However, the true insidious nature of Kill Soo Lee's grand scheme began to manifest its destructive power long before any of these hopeful women ever set foot on an airplane bound for the distant South Pacific. Access to this highly touted promised prosperity came at a ruinous, debilitating preliminary cost. The labor brokers, acting under the framework established by Lee, demanded exorbitant, non-negotiable security deposits simply to secure a coveted position on the factory floor. The required upfront fees ranged arbitrarily, yet devastatingly, from $3,500 to $8,000 per single person. In the stark economic context of late 1998 for rural Vietnamese and Chinese agricultural or working-class families, these specific financial figures were genuinely astronomical. They represented unimaginable sums of wealth, often equating to decades of continuous savings. To raise this required capital and secure the chance at the American dream, the workers and their desperate families were forced to resort to extreme, irreversible financial measures. They mortgaged their ancestral homes, liquidated every piece of arable land or valuable physical asset they possessed, and, most dangerously, took out massive high-interest loans from predatory local moneylenders and shadow banking networks. They placed their entire collective futures, their homes, and their livelihoods at massive calculated risk. They acted on the absolute, unwavering faith that the high wages explicitly promised by the brokers would easily allow them to quickly repay these massive debts and eventually build a life of comfort. The financial devastation, therefore, was entirely complete before the journey even began. The workers were systematically stripped of their financial independence and security, transitioning instantly from hopeful autonomous laborers to heavily indebted, desperate individuals balancing dangerously on the precipice of total generational economic ruin. Yet, the extortionate recruitment fees were merely the first layer of the trap. Kill Soo Lee, operating as a master architect of exploitation, left absolutely nothing to chance or human unpredictability. He understood perfectly that a heavily indebted worker, pushed to the absolute limits of human endurance by brutal factory conditions, might still possess the innate psychological breaking point necessary to attempt an escape or seek outside assistance. To absolutely guarantee their perpetual subjugation and eliminate any possibility of rebellion, he engineered a highly complex, legally binding employment contract that directly weaponized their newly acquired, crushing debt against them. Buried deep within the dense, intimidating paperwork that the workers were forced to sign, often in languages they could barely comprehend, was a draconian, uncompromising penalty clause that served as the ultimate mechanism of psychological and physical control. The clause explicitly legally stipulated that if a worker voluntarily abandoned their assigned position, attempted to quit due to working conditions, or simply failed to complete the full, grueling 3-year term of the contract for absolutely any reason whatsoever, they would immediately be subjected to a catastrophic secondary financial penalty. A massive additional fine of exactly $5,000 would be instantly levied against them, and this unpayable debt would be directly, aggressively enforced upon their vulnerable families remaining behind in their home countries. This singular, quietly inserted contractual detail completely transformed a severe, existing financial burden into a relentless mechanism of absolute psychological terror. It fundamentally shifted the dynamic of the arrangement from a standard international labor agreement to a highly organized hostage negotiation, where the hostages were the isolated workers themselves, and the ransom was the continued survival and safety of their families across the ocean. By signing this document, driven by desperation and false promises, the young women unknowingly locked the heavy iron doors of their own devastating trap. If they stayed in American Samoa, they were entirely at the mercy of whatever brutal, inhumane conditions Kill Soo Lee chose to impose within the confines of his isolated factory. If they dared to flee, speak out, or organize against him, they would immediately trigger the complete, irreversible financial destruction of the very families they had sacrificed absolutely everything to support and uplift. They were systematically, deliberately stripped of their agency, cornered on all sides by a transnational scam that expertly utilized the legal framework of international labor migration to construct a sophisticated, modern architecture of slavery. As they finally packed their meager personal belongings, said tearful goodbyes to their heavily indebted parents, and prepared to depart across the ocean for what they genuinely believed was the promise of American prosperity, they were entirely unaware of the grim reality. They had just financed their own long-term captivity, paying thousands of borrowed dollars to be shipped like cargo to a profoundly isolated island facility where the basic fundamental tenets of human rights and dignity had been intentionally, methodically dismantled in the pursuit of untaxed corporate profit. The immense geographical distance of Pago Pago from the watchful eyes of the mainland was matched only by the vast, unbridgeable tragic chasm between the glittering promises made to these young women and the bleak, inescapable, violent reality that patiently awaited them within the towering barbed wire fences of the Daewoo complex. The moment the commercial aircraft wheels touched down on the humid, tropical tarmac of the Pago Pago International Airport in early 1999, the carefully constructed illusion of the American dream began its irreversible disintegration for the arriving workers. Stepping out of the pressurized cabin, they were immediately hit by the dense, suffocating equatorial heat of the South Pacific, a stark physical contrast to the temperate climates many had left behind in their home provinces. However, the true shock was not environmental, but rather terrifyingly systemic. Instantaneously upon their arrival, before they could even process their new surroundings or acclimate to the jarring time difference, the mechanisms of Kill Soo Lee's control were brutally enacted. Agents acting on his direct orders systematically intercepted the newly arrived, disoriented women. In a highly coordinated, swift maneuver that left no room for question or resistance, every single passport, travel document, and piece of official identification was forcibly confiscated from the workers. This action was not presented as a temporary administrative procedure for safekeeping, but rather executed with the cold, efficient finality of a prison intake process. In the span of a few chaotic minutes within the airport terminal, these young women were officially stripped of their legal identities, their freedom of movement, and their fundamental capacity to leave the island. They were instantly rendered undocumented, invisible, and entirely dependent on the very entity that had just stolen their autonomy. Without their passports, they were no longer international migrant workers. They were effectively stateless captives trapped on a tiny, isolated volcanic rock in the middle of a vast ocean, completely severed from any diplomatic protection or avenue of escape. Following this devastating confiscation, the workers were not led to the comfortable accommodations they had been promised by the deceptive labor brokers in Asia. Instead, they were loaded onto transport vehicles and driven directly to the deteriorating Daewoo corporate complex in the Western Village area. As the vehicles approached the facility, the visual reality of their new existence became horrifyingly clear. The compound was not a modern manufacturing hub, but rather a decaying, fortress-like enclosure designed specifically for containment. The perimeter was heavily fortified, entirely surrounded by tall, imposing fences topped with thick coils of sharp barbed wire that glinted menacingly in the tropical sun. The gates were heavily chained and monitored continuously by a formidable, intimidating force of local security guards who patrolled the grounds 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. These guards were not there to protect the workers from external threats, but rather to ensure that the workers themselves could absolutely never cross the threshold back into the outside world. The women were aggressively herded into a series of cramped, claustrophobic, and unsanitary dormitory units located deep within the heavily guarded compound. The doors were locked, the perimeter was sealed, and the terrifying reality of their situation settled heavily upon them. They had mortgaged their entire familial futures to travel thousands of miles, only to walk directly into an operational concentration camp masquerading as an apparel factory. Within the fortified barbed wire confines of the Daewoo compound, the systemic deprivation began immediately, attacking the workers at the most fundamental level of human biological need. Kill Soo Lee's ruthless strategy for maximizing absolute corporate profit extended far beyond mere wage theft. It fundamentally relied upon the intentional minimization of overhead costs, which most prominently included the basic sustenance required to keep his captive workforce alive. The concept of adequate nutrition was abandoned, replaced by a deliberate program of systemic starvation designed to simultaneously save money and physically weaken the workers, thereby drastically reducing any potential capacity for physical resistance or organized rebellion. The daily provisions allocated to the hundreds of exhausted women were appallingly, criminally inadequate. The meals primarily consisted of little more than severely watered-down rice porridge, a flavorless gruel devoid of any substantive caloric or nutritional value. On the rare occasions when solid food was provided, it was often nothing more than a meager scoop of plain, undercooked white rice accompanied by microscopic, practically unidentifiable scraps of heavily spoiled, rotting meat that emanated a sickening, putrid odor. Consuming this rancid food frequently led to severe gastrointestinal distress, yet the gnawing, persistent agony of continuous starvation often forced the women to ingest whatever horrific sustenance was placed before them. As the weeks dragged into months, the physical toll of this chronic malnourishment became undeniably, visually apparent. The once healthy, hopeful young women rapidly deteriorated, their bodies visibly wasting away under the brutal combination of intense physical labor and severe caloric deficit. Their faces became gaunt, their eyes hollowed out from exhaustion and hunger, and their physical strength steadily evaporated. The overwhelming desperation bred by this unyielding starvation inevitably drove the workers to acts of profound, humiliating necessity. Deprived of basic human dignity within the walls, they were forced to seek salvation from the outside. On numerous heartbreaking occasions, local Samoan residents walking or driving past the perimeter of the Daiwisa facility witnessed deeply disturbing, unforgettable scenes. Through the small, restrictive gaps in the heavy chain link and barbed wire fences, the desperate Vietnamese and Chinese women would thrust their thin, trembling hands outward. With tears streaming down their emaciated faces, they would desperately gesture and plead with the passing strangers, begging frantically for any discarded scraps of food or a simple bottle of clean drinking water. This horrifying spectacle of modern-day slaves begging for basic sustenance through a wire fence in a United States territory stands as a stark, damning testament to the absolute failure of oversight and the depths of Kil Su Lee's depravity. When begging proved insufficient, the raw, primal instinct for survival forced the women to take even greater, highly dangerous risks. Under the cloak of darkness, risking severe physical beatings from the aggressive security patrols if discovered, groups of starving workers would silently sneak out of their sweltering dormitories. They would cautiously navigate the dark, treacherous compound, desperately foraging the overgrown edges of the property in search of wild, unripe green papayas or absolutely any edible vegetation that might temporarily dull the agonizing, relentless cramps of starvation tearing at their stomachs. The physical torment of their systemic starvation was infinitely compounded by the barbaric, highly dangerous conditions they were forced to endure daily on the manufacturing floor. The Daiwisa factory building itself was a sprawling, dilapidated, and entirely unventilated industrial structure that functioned less as a workplace and more as a massive, stifling sweatbox. Positioned near the equator, American Samoa experiences intense, unrelenting tropical heat, and the factory possessed no functioning air conditioning or adequate ventilation systems to mitigate the soaring temperatures. Consequently, the ambient temperature inside the densely packed, poorly lit production facility consistently hovered relentlessly above 34 degrees Celsius, creating an oppressive, suffocating atmosphere that felt incredibly heavy and hostile to human life. The air within the building was entirely stagnant, thick with the suffocating dust of synthetic fabrics, the noxious chemical fumes of garment dyes, and the collective, desperate sweat of hundreds of exhausted bodies. Within this brutal, punishing inferno, the captive women were not permitted to rest, hydrate, or even slow down their frantic pace of production. They were forced to operate heavy, dangerous industrial sewing machinery for agonizingly long, uninterrupted shifts that routinely stretched from 12 to 14 consecutive hours per day, completely disregarding any established legal standard for maximum working hours or mandatory rest periods. The physical demands of the labor were completely unrelenting. The supervisors demanded an impossibly high, continuously accelerating rate of production, driving the malnourished, severely weakened women to the absolute outermost limits of their physical and neurological endurance. The repetitive, high-speed motions required by the sewing lines, combined with the extreme heat and chronic exhaustion, frequently caused workers to collapse directly at their workstations, completely losing consciousness mid-stitch. Yet, even this brutal, life-threatening physical exertion was entirely devoid of any financial compensation or reward. The substantial, life-changing wages that had been so aggressively promised by the deceitful labor brokers in Asia proved to be nothing more than a cruel fictional mechanism of entrapment. Kil Su Lee arbitrarily and continuously withheld the workers' rightful earnings. Month after agonizing month, paychecks simply never materialized. When the desperate women dared to inquire about their missing wages, Lee and his management team would invent a dizzying, ever-shifting array of fraudulent deductions. They would claim that the entirety of the workers' earnings had been retroactively confiscated to cover the exorbitant, entirely inflated costs of their squalid dormitory housing, the putrid, rotten food they were barely provided, or the ongoing fabricated fees allegedly owed to the original recruitment agencies. The workers were thus trapped in a perpetual, agonizing cycle of high-intensity, dangerous slave labor, generating untaxed profits for the Daewoo Corporation, while simultaneously sinking deeper into an inescapable, fabricated debt that existed entirely on Kil-Soo Lee's manipulated ledgers. However, the physical brutality, the grueling manual labor, and the agonizing starvation were only the visible, tangible components of Kil-Soo Lee's comprehensive architecture of subjugation. The truly insidious, paralyzing element of the Daewoo compound was the relentless, highly sophisticated campaign of psychological terror orchestrated to completely crush the human spirit and eradicate any lingering thoughts of solidarity or resistance. Kil-Soo Lee cultivated an atmosphere of constant, suffocating fear, utilizing the workers' extreme vulnerability and geographical isolation as weapons of mass psychological destruction. Any minor expression of discontent, any whispered complaint about the unbearable heat, the rotting food, or the stolen wages, was met with immediate, overwhelming, and highly disproportionate retaliation. The management team maintained a vast, pervasive network of surveillance and intimidation, ensuring that the workers felt constantly monitored and fundamentally unsafe, even within the confines of their locked dormitories. The most potent, devastating psychological weapon in Lee's arsenal was the constant, looming threat of immediate deportation, a threat directly inextricably linked to the ruinous, $5,000 penalty clauses hidden within their original employment contracts. The workers knew with absolute, terrifying certainty that if they were sent back to Vietnam or China, their families would be instantly destroyed by the unpayable debt, losing their homes and their livelihoods. Lee exploited this deep, familial devotion ruthlessly, using the love the women had for their parents and children as the very chains that bound them to his factory floor. When the psychological threat of financial ruin was deemed insufficient to maintain unquestioning compliance, the management escalated to grotesque, highly traumatizing forms of physical punishment designed to publicly humiliate and terrify the entire workforce. For those who dared to show even the slightest hint of defiance, or those who simply failed to meet the impossible, ever-increasing production quotas, a specialized horrific punishment awaited them. Located ominously within the factory compound was an abandoned, severely dilapidated swimming pool. Over time, this pool had become filled with stagnant, deeply polluted, putrid water, serving as a breeding ground for disease and becoming heavily littered with the decomposing, rotting corpses of countless dead frogs and other local vermin. As the ultimate, sickening disciplinary measure, security guards would forcibly drag the offending, terrified workers to the edge of this nauseating hazard. While the rest of the workforce was forced to watch in silent, paralyzed horror, the guards would violently hurl the women directly into the dark, foul-smelling, disease-ridden water, forcing them to submerge themselves among the rotting animal carcasses. This traumatic, degrading act was not merely a physical punishment. It was a profound, calculated psychological violation designed to strip the workers of their last remaining shreds of human dignity. It sent a clear, unmistakable, chilling message to every single person trapped within the barbed wire. In the isolated, forgotten territory of the Daewoo compound, Kil-Soo Lee was the absolute, unquestioned authority, possessing the terrifying, unchecked power to inflict boundless, grotesque suffering upon them, and no one from the outside world was ever going to come to their rescue. They were utterly abandoned to a meticulously designed, inescapable hell. As the calendar turned toward the final months of the year 2000, the internal pressure within the Daewoo compound had reached a critical, explosive threshold. The sustained systemic deprivation, the combination of relentless starvation, physically punishing labor, and the suffocating atmosphere of psychological terror, had eroded the workers' spirits to the point of near total collapse. Yet, it was precisely at this moment of deepest despair that a flickering, desperate spark of collective resistance ignited. Recognizing that their slow, agonizing deterioration would inevitably lead to death if they remained entirely passive, A small clandestine group of Vietnamese laborers managed to organize a desperate, highly risky act of defiance. They recognized that their isolation was the primary shield protecting Kil Su Lee from outside scrutiny, and therefore, their singular, only hope for survival lay in breaking through that silence to communicate with the world beyond the perimeter fences. Amidst the chaos of the production floor, in a moment of extreme coordinated caution, one worker managed to produce a smuggled, handwritten plea for assistance, marked with the universal, desperate, and unmistakable distress signal, SOS. This plea for help was not entrusted to any institutional channel. Rather, it was cleverly, covertly hidden and successfully lobbed through a partially open window of a vehicle during a rare, brief, and highly monitored interaction near the factory gates. This single frantic action acted as the catalyst for the entire, slow-building house of cards to finally collapse. The written plea reached the hands of an individual outside the compound, who, recognizing the gravity of the contents, forwarded the information to the United States Department of Labor. The arrival of federal investigators at the Daiwissa site marked the first significant, external intervention in the compound's history. For the first time, Kil Su Lee was forced to engage with the reality that his isolationist, predatory model of production was under the direct, formal and authoritative investigation of mainland United States government agencies. The investigators, tasked with evaluating the veracity of the horrific claims of human trafficking and severe labor violations, were confronted with a chaotic, traumatizing environment that defied their standard regulatory expectations. The Department of Labor's initial investigation resulted in the formal assessment of fines against Lee totaling more than $350,000. This was a massive, unprecedented financial penalty intended to curb the systemic exploitation and serve as an immediate, firm demand for the restoration of the workers' unpaid, rightfully earned wages. However, the intervention also exposed the absolute, terrifying extent of Lee's control over the captive workforce. Even in the face of federal scrutiny, Lee remained utterly unrepentant and increasingly desperate, recognizing that his financial empire was finally beginning to unravel. In a move that displayed his utter, contemptuous disregard for the law, Lee immediately devised a plan to neutralize the impact of the federal intervention. The investigators forced him to issue checks representing the stolen, back-owed wages to the workers. Yet, the moment the federal authorities retreated from the immediate vicinity of the factory, Lee initiated a secondary, highly coercive, and utterly fraudulent recovery campaign. He systematically rounded up the workers and, utilizing his now established, deeply ingrained methods of psychological intimidation and threat of familial ruin, forced them to immediately endorse and return the entirety of those checks back into his personal private bank accounts. Those few workers who possessed the immense individual courage to refuse this final blatant robbery were immediately identified, marked, and forcibly ejected from the compound. They were summarily abandoned in a foreign land with no financial resources, no documentation, and no means of support, serving as a chilling public example to the remaining captives of the severe, direct consequences of resisting Lee's absolute authority. During this period of intense, chaotic federal scrutiny, the Daiwissa facility was also operating under the massive, compounding pressure of a gigantic, time-sensitive commercial order from the prominent, prestigious mainland American retail giant, J.C. Penney. This contract demanded a massive, unrealistic volume of apparel to be manufactured and shipped within an impossibly short 2-month turnaround time. The tension between the federal investigation, the lingering threat of exposure, and the unrelenting, punishing deadlines imposed by the retail giant created a truly combustible atmosphere of extreme, uncontrolled volatility. Kil Su Lee, increasingly desperate to meet the production quotas and secure the significant, final payout from the contract, discarded all remaining fragile pretenses of humane operation. His descent into pure, unadulterated savagery became absolute. He abandoned the facade of a manager and openly embraced the role of a despot, viewing his workforce not as human beings with fundamental rights, but merely as expendable, disposable biological components of a production machine. In this state of paranoid, frenzied desperation, he delegated the enforcement of his will to a local Samoan supervisor named Elikana Nuli Ione, a man who had proven himself more than willing to implement and escalate the factory's brutal, disciplinary culture. Lee's instructions were direct, unmistakable, and terrifying in their utter disregard for human life. He clearly ordered Ione, with a chilling, calculated finality, to exert whatever level of physical force was deemed necessary to drive the production rates to the required levels. He instructed the manager to violently strike any worker who showed the slightest sign of hesitation, fatigue, or resistance, and to forcibly eject them from the factory floor if they remained non-compliant. Most damningly, he explicitly stated, with a level of cold-blooded, premeditated indifference that would later serve as central critical evidence in his federal criminal trial, that if any of the laborers were killed in the course of these beatings, he would take personal full responsibility for the consequences. This explicit directive acted as a formal green light for the systemic transformation of the factory into an active, violent, and unchecked site of assault. The inevitable, tragic, and long-simmering violence finally reached its explosive, horrifying crescendo on the 28th of November 2000. On this day, a group of exhausted, starving Vietnamese female laborers finally reached their absolute, collective breaking point. Despite the constant, looming threats of retaliatory violence, physical expulsion, and the devastating, irreversible ruin of their families, they refused to return to their machines. They gathered on the factory floor in a unified, courageous display of protest, demanding the overdue stolen wages and the cessation of the systematic starvation-level deprivation they had been forced to endure for months. This act of peaceful protest was met with immediate, calculated, and overwhelming lethal aggression. Elikana Nuli Ione, acting directly upon Kil Suli's earlier, explicit instructions, did not attempt any form of mediation or negotiation. Instead, he lunged with murderous, focused intent toward a specific young female worker named Trong Thi Le Nguyen. In a brutal, sustained act of physical assault that clearly demonstrated the intent to maim or kill, Ione grabbed Nguyen by the throat and squeezed with both hands, steadily, purposefully cutting off her supply of oxygen until her vision dimmed and she collapsed into a state of unconsciousness. When the nearby, horrified colleagues witnessed this direct, life-threatening assault on one of their own, they instinctively broke their ranks to intervene and attempt to save her life. This, however, was precisely the reaction Lee had anticipated and planned for. He immediately commanded the deployment of a waiting, prepared force of more than 20 large, physically imposing local security guards, all of whom had been stationed near the facility specifically to break any potential collective action. The scene that followed on the production floor was not merely an act of discipline. It was a systematic, coordinated, and extraordinarily violent assault, described by witnesses at the subsequent criminal trial as a genuine, terrifying act of carnage. The guards, armed with heavy, rigid, industrial-grade PVC pipes and blunt, dangerous metal tools, descended upon the defenseless, unarmed women. There was no parity, no defense, and no escape. It was a one-sided, merciless, and sustained campaign of physical destruction. The guards utilized the heavy, blunt instruments to strike the women across their heads, their torsos, and their limbs with a level of force that clearly indicated a total, callous indifference to the potential for fatal injury. The air was filled with the sickening, sharp cracks of pipe hitting bone, the desperate, guttural screams of the victims, and the frantic, chaotic movement of people attempting to flee a lethal trap. In one of the most agonizing, specifically recalled instances of this brutal, sustained assault, a guard utilized a section of broken, jagged PVC piping with a sharp, pointed, and dangerous edge. With a cold, calculated, and focused motion, he drove the improvised, lethal weapon directly into the face of Trong Thi Le Nguyen, the very woman who had initially been singled out for the assault. The impact was devastating, resulting in the permanent, irreversible destruction of one of her eyes. The factory floor was instantly transformed into a horrific, blood-soaked crime scene. Crimson blood sprayed from the victim's wounds, coating the metallic, indifferent industrial machinery, splashing onto the floor in thick, darkening puddles, and staining the long, unfinished, and neatly arranged lengths of textile fabric that were being processed for the mainland market. The visual image was so thoroughly, profoundly traumatizing, a visceral, nightmarish synthesis of high-speed industrial production and raw, uncontrolled human suffering, that it remained seared into the memories of every person who witnessed it. One individual, providing a harrowing, detailed account during the criminal proceedings, described the scene as indistinguishable from a cinematic, high-budget horror film, centered on a brutal, systematic massacre. The violence was not merely an individual, isolated incident, but a profound structural failure where the profit motive had completely eclipsed every remaining, essential human consideration. and the cold industrial environment of the factory had been permanently, irreversibly stained by the blood of the people it was built to exploit. This event was the absolute, final and inescapable realization of the nightmare kill Sue Lee had orchestrated. A moment where the invisible, systematic and everyday horrors of the Daewoo compound finally manifested, in an explosive, undeniable and truly horrific display of physical violence that could no longer be ignored or obscured by the geographical isolation of the island. It was the point of no return, the moment where the internal reality of the camp was violently, irreversibly projected into the light of external, federal and international attention. The violent explosion of brutality within the Daewoo facility served as a gruesome final breach in the walls of Kill Sue Lee's manufactured isolation. The aftermath of the November 28 assault did not simply result in physical trauma for the workers. It fundamentally shattered the veil of secrecy that had allowed Lee to operate with such profound impunity for nearly 2 years. The severity of the injuries, the loss of an eye, the internal trauma, and the sheer scale of the coordinated assault could no longer be dismissed as internal labor disputes or localized managerial incompetence. The sheer graphic nature of the massacre caught the attention of both local law enforcement agencies in American Samoa and, more crucially, federal investigative arms of the United States government, including the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which began to mobilize from its hub in Honolulu, Hawaii. The intervention was swift, dramatic, and absolute. It involved the deployment of specialized teams tasked with conducting a massive, cross-jurisdictional sweep of the facility, the documentation of the crime scene, and the immediate, urgent provision of humanitarian aid to the hundreds of women who had been trapped in the compound. In January 2001, the High Court of American Samoa, acting with the weight of both local and federal authority, issued an ironclad, permanent injunction that effectively signaled the total legal end of the Daewoo operation. The factory was shuttered, the machinery was seized, and the facility was formally condemned. However, the closure of the factory did not mark the end of the misery for the laborers. Instead, it ushered in a new, distinct phase of abandonment and profound uncertainty. Kill Sue Lee, demonstrating the same ruthless, opportunistic nature that defined his entire business model, had been meticulously preparing for this eventuality. Recognizing that the walls were closing in, he had systematically moved to liquidate his remaining assets, tarnish the records, and scrub the facility of any trace of his personal involvement. In a final malicious act of betrayal, he abruptly abandoned the site, leaving behind more than 200 destitute, terrified workers. These women were left to fend for themselves in a foreign, unfamiliar environment, entirely stripped of their financial resources, their documents, and their basic means of survival. They were essentially stranded on a remote Pacific island with no food, no housing, no way to contact their families, and absolutely no way to afford the airfare required to return home to Vietnam or China. The abandonment was total, transforming the victims of industrial exploitation into victims of immediate, life-threatening deprivation. The humanitarian crisis that followed was both immediate and dire. The United States government, working in collaboration with a coalition of various international and local non-governmental organizations, was forced to initiate an urgent, large-scale emergency relief operation. These organizations worked around the clock to establish improvised housing, secure regular food deliveries, and provide basic essential medical care for the workers, many of whom were still suffering from the lingering physical wounds and the deep psychological scarring of their long-term captivity. It was during this period of emergency stabilization that the true, harrowing scale of the human trafficking operation became clearly understood by investigators. The workers, finally free from the immediate threat of violence, began to piece together their testimonies, describing in excruciating detail the systemic nature of their starvation, the constant psychological terror, and the orchestration of the November massacre. These testimonies provided the bedrock for the subsequent federal investigation. The evidence was not merely circumstantial. It was voluminous, involving records of international wire transfers, manipulated payroll ledgers, and the forensic documentation of the injuries sustained by the survivors. The gathered evidence was so comprehensive and devastating that it made the eventual arrest and prosecution of Kill Sue Lee inevitable. On the 23rd of March 2001, FBI agents officially executed a high-priority, emergency warrant for the arrest of Kill Sue Lee, apprehending him directly within the territory of American Samoa. Because of the magnitude of the crimes, the complexity of the federal charges, and the potential for local corruption or interference if the trial were held on the island, the authorities made the strategic, necessary decision to immediately move the proceedings. Kil Soo Lee was placed in federal custody and subjected to an intensive multi-thousand-mile transfer by aircraft, being transported directly to the mainland United States, specifically to Hawaii, to stand trial in federal court. This transition from the localized, vulnerable environment of American Samoa to the rigorous, impartial, and highly scrutinized jurisdiction of a United States federal courtroom was the critical turning point in the pursuit of justice. The federal trial of Kil Soo Lee was a massive, highly complex, and emotionally taxing legal proceeding that spanned many months. It became a public, definitive, and profoundly public accounting of the crimes that had occurred in the dark corner of the Pacific. Central to the prosecution's strategy was the testimony of 36 individual witnesses, each of whom played a critical role in weaving together the narrative of the Diwisa operation. Among these, 21 women stood out for their immense courage. These were workers who, having survived the torture, the starvation, and the trauma of the massacre, now had to step into a sterile, intimidating federal courtroom to face their former captor. They were forced to publicly relive their most painful, humiliating memories under the aggressive, often dismissive cross-examination of the defense attorneys. They recounted the daily reality of their captivity, the specific ways in which their movements were monitored, the specific threats leveled against their families, and the horrifying visceral details of the assault on the factory floor. Their testimony was not just evidence. It was a profound, defiant reclamation of their humanity from a man who had sought to turn them into non-entities. Kil Soo Lee, for his part, mounted a cynical, highly strategic defense. His legal team attempted to challenge the very foundations of the prosecution, most notably by arguing that the federal court in Hawaii lacked the proper legal jurisdiction to try the crimes. Lee's team attempted to frame the issues as localized, minor, and ultimately under the purview of the American Samoan courts, where they clearly believed they could exercise greater influence, manipulate the local procedural delays, and potentially escape the most severe penalties associated with federal statutes. They sought to portray the entire saga as a series of unfortunate, exaggerated labor disputes, rather than a premeditated, systematic criminal enterprise of human trafficking and modern-day slavery. However, the federal court was resolute. The judge and the prosecution systematically dismantled each of these defense arguments, pointing to the federal interstate nature of the crimes, the explicit violations of human rights protected by United States law, and the overwhelming, corroborating physical evidence. The federal court asserted its authority with complete, unyielding certainty, effectively closing the door on any possibility that Lee could evade justice by returning the case to the island's jurisdiction. The final verdict, delivered after months of intensive testimony, deliberations, and the rigorous presentation of evidence, was a decisive historic moment for the victims and for federal labor law. The jury found Kil Soo Lee guilty on 14 distinct, serious criminal charges. These charges were comprehensive, covering the entire spectrum of his predatory actions, including the conscious, systematic violation of the civil rights of his workers, the maintenance of involuntary servitude, the orchestration of large-scale, systematic extortion, and the complex laundering of illicitly obtained funds. Each charge reflected a different aspect of the trauma inflicted upon the workers, from the physical to the financial, from the psychological to the institutional. The court's recognition of these charges established a powerful, necessary precedent that recognized the plight of these women, not merely as victims of a bad business deal, but as survivors of a criminal conspiracy. The sentencing phase, which followed the conviction, further underscored the gravity of the court's judgment. In 2005, the judge handed down a sentence that was intended to reflect the total catastrophic impact of Lee's actions. Kil Soo Lee was sentenced to 40 years of incarceration in a maximum security federal prison, a penalty that would ensure he spent the remainder of his most productive years entirely removed from the society he had so cruelly exploited. Additionally, the court imposed a mandatory, significant financial restitution order, requiring Lee to pay $1.8 million to the victims. This was an attempt, however small and inadequate, to provide some measure of compensation for the years of their lives that had been stolen, the physical injuries they had endured, and the financial ruin their families had suffered back home. The court also ensured that the various accomplices and management figures, such as the supervisor who had led the brutal assault on the factory floor, were also identified, tried, and given substantial commensurate prison sentences. This was not a matter of punishing a lone actor, but of dismantling the entire apparatus of violence and control that had functioned within the Daiwusa walls. By the time the final gavel fell, the court had successfully sent an unequivocal, powerful message to the corporate world and to traffickers everywhere. The geographical isolation of a business operation did not grant immunity from the reach of the law. The systematic exploitation of workers, when brought to the light of a federal courtroom, would be met with the full, unwavering force of the United States justice system. The trial of Kill Soo Lee remains a landmark case in the history of international labor law, a somber, definitive reminder of what happens when greed is permitted to operate without the essential fundamental check of human rights and federal regulatory oversight. It was a victory for the 21 women who had stood in that courtroom, but more importantly, it was a victory for the principle that no individual, regardless of their corporate power or their remote location, can ever be allowed to treat other human beings as disposable property. The sentencing of Kill Soo Lee to 40 years in a federal penitentiary provided a formal, legal conclusion to the criminal proceedings. Yet the resolution of the case did not end with the gavel's final strike. The aftermath of the trial served as a profound, transformative moment not only for the individual survivors, but also for the broader understanding of human trafficking within the United States. For the survivors, the verdict offered a degree of validated closure. It officially recognized their experiences not as unfortunate accidents of industrial failure, but as crimes committed against their fundamental human dignity. However, the path forward for these women remained riddled with uncertainty, as they navigated the complexities of life in a country that had become both their prison and their only hope for a future. The survivors, having endured the absolute worst of human behavior, now had to reckon with the task of rebuilding their lives in the shadow of their traumatic past. The federal government, cognizant of the immense debt it owed to these individuals for their role in exposing the systemic depravity of the Daiwusa operation, took unprecedented steps to integrate them into the mainland United States. This transition was far from simple. These women were not merely migrants arriving under standard, predictable circumstances. They were survivors of a high-profile, violent, and exploitative criminal enterprise. The process of supporting them required a delicate, ongoing commitment that transcended standard bureaucratic practices. Many of the survivors struggled with severe, persistent symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, the result of years spent in a constant state of fear, hunger, and physical instability. Providing them with specialized trauma-informed care became a primary objective of the humanitarian agencies that had initially intervened. These professionals worked to create a safe, supportive environment where the women could begin the arduous process of healing, away from the constant, crushing pressures they had experienced on the island. The integration process was facilitated by the issuance of T visas, a specific, specialized legal designation designed for victims of severe forms of human trafficking. This, perhaps more than any other singular action, represented a monumental shift in how the United States federal government conceptualized the intersection of immigration policy and human rights. The T visa was not merely a document permitting temporary stay. It was a fundamental acknowledgement by the state that these individuals had been severely wronged, and that the state possessed a direct, ethical responsibility to protect them and offer them a pathway to long-term stability. For the survivors, the receipt of these visas was a life-altering event. It provided them with the legal security to reside, work, and contribute to communities in the mainland United States, effectively transforming their status from that of discarded, invisible laborers to that of recognized, protected residents. This legal shift was matched by a concerted, collaborative effort between government entities and various non-governmental organizations to provide the survivors with the essential resources required for their new lives. They were assisted in finding gainful, ethical employment, obtaining affordable housing, and accessing the healthcare systems necessary to address the long-term physical injuries they had sustained, such as the lasting impact of the violence on their vision, their mobility, and their general health. The survivors, in turn, demonstrated remarkable, persistent resilience. Many began to integrate into their new communities, learning the nuances of a new culture, navigating the complexities of an unfamiliar language, and slowly, painstakingly, building the small, sustainable lives that had been denied to them for so long. The story of the Daiwusa survivors became a potent, enduring symbol of the fight against modern-day slavery. Their collective experience, revealed through the intensive testimonies provided during the federal trial, became a foundational resource for human rights advocates, labor unions, and policymakers. They moved from being victims of a hidden, isolated crime to becoming the most compelling, powerful advocates for systemic reform. Their voices were instrumental in articulating the gaps in existing labor law, the weaknesses in the enforcement of worker protections, and the ways in which corporate interests could, if left unchecked, exploit the vulnerabilities of impoverished populations on a global scale. The survivors, in sharing their stories, forced the public, the media, and the political establishment to confront the uncomfortable reality that human trafficking was not a relic of the past, but a contemporary, thriving, and highly profitable enterprise that could exist even under the flag of the United States. Their testimony was not merely a recounting of victimization. It was a defiant, authoritative, and essential piece of historical evidence that challenged the status quo. The broader implications of their struggle rippled across the legal and humanitarian landscapes, fostering a new, heightened awareness of the risks faced by migrant workers in remote, underregulated environments. The case highlighted the urgent necessity for more robust, proactive, and cross-border oversight of transnational labor recruitment practices. It demanded that corporations, regardless of their size or their geographical positioning, be held strictly legally accountable for the conditions of the workers within their supply chains. The survivors' journey from the barbed wire fences of Pago Pago to the halls of federal justice provided a clear, actionable roadmap for how the system could, and indeed must, intervene to protect the most vulnerable members of the global workforce. This period of recovery and transition was marked by a profound, collective reckoning with the nature of the Diwusa operation. Analysts and historians of the case began to parse the intricate ways in which Kil Su Lee had weaponized the complexities of international trade and labor migration. They examined how the specific, isolated nature of American Samoa had been intentionally selected to evade the reach of mainland regulators, effectively creating a jurisdictional gray zone where the most egregious labor abuses could be conducted with minimal fear of repercussions. The case provided a quintessential example of how the pursuit of untaxed, high-margin manufacturing, when combined with an absolute predatory disregard for human rights, could create a cycle of exploitation that appeared, at least initially, to be entirely sustainable for the perpetrator. The trial succeeded in exposing this entire logic, deconstructing the mechanisms of control and coercion that had kept the Diwusa operation functional for as long as it had. It demonstrated that the most effective, potent defense against such predatory practices was not found in the inherent benevolence of the corporate world, but in the power of coordinated, external oversight and the courage of the survivors to speak the truth. The survivors' persistence, their willingness to confront their former captor, and their ability to endure the scrutiny of a federal trial were the decisive factors that brought the Diwusa era to a definitive legal end. The lasting impact of the survivors' actions is best illustrated by the profound, structural changes that were initiated in the years immediately following the trial. The case provided the necessary urgent political momentum for a comprehensive legislative response to human trafficking. It served as a visceral, undeniable catalyst for the formal passage and rigorous implementation of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, TVPA. The TVPA, in turn, became the primary legal framework for the United States fight against trafficking, providing law enforcement with the expanded, modern tools, the clear legal definitions, and the specific investigative powers required to combat these complex, transnational crimes effectively. By ensuring that victims like those from Diwusa were afforded both legal protection and the necessary resources to assist in the prosecution of their captors, the legislation directly linked the human rights of the victims to the successful dismantling of trafficking networks. The survivors, through their extraordinary struggle and their public resilience, had effectively shaped the future of the nation's legal response to slavery. They had taken a personal, localized tragedy and forced the entire country to acknowledge it as a systemic, structural, and critical issue of national and international concern. The survivors' contribution to this legislative change cannot be overstated. They were the human face of the suffering that the TVPA was designed to end. As they continued their lives in the mainland, they did so as the architects of a legacy that would protect thousands of future individuals from the same fate they had endured. Their courage had transformed their own victimization into a powerful, permanent tool for the protection of others. the Daewisa survivors, through their endurance and their pursuit of justice, had successfully challenged the cold, industrial logic of human exploitation, ensuring that the blood spilled on the factory floor of Pago Pago would ultimately serve to water the roots of a more robust, protective, and compassionate legal environment for all vulnerable workers. Their legacy remains etched into the history of the federal justice system, as a testament to the fact that, regardless of how dark, isolated, or secure the fortress of the oppressor may appear, the pursuit of justice, supported by the truth, can and will eventually dismantle it. The case of Kill Soo Lee and the Daewisa factory, therefore, exists not just as a horrific instance of individual and systemic failure, but as a critical, enduring milestone in the ongoing, global struggle for the protection of human rights in an increasingly interconnected and often exploitative world economy. It serves as a stark, definitive, and highly necessary reminder that the dignity of the human person must always, under all circumstances, take precedence over the unbridled, unethical pursuit of commercial and corporate profit. The final, lasting resonance of the Daewisa tragedy serves as a profound, somber, and permanent reflection on the true cost of unbridled corporate greed, when it is allowed to operate in the shadows of legal and geographic detachment. As the years have passed since the courtroom in Hawaii delivered its decisive verdict, the narrative of these more than 200 workers has shifted from a breaking news story of exploitation to a fundamental, foundational case study within the global discourse on human rights, labor trafficking, and the accountability of multinational supply chains. The legacy of the women who suffered within the barbed wire fences of Pago Pago is not merely one of victimization, but one of immense, historic transformation. They were the catalysts who stripped away the facade of legitimate, American-labeled manufacturing to reveal the brutal industrial-scale servitude that existed beneath it. Their experiences forced an entire nation, and subsequently the broader international community, to confront the uncomfortable reality that modern slavery is not a relic of a primitive, bygone era, but a highly sophisticated, adaptive, and dangerous component of the globalized, profit-driven economy. The story of their endurance, their trauma, and their eventual hard-won justice stands as a stark, enduring reminder that the fundamental dignity of the human person must remain the paramount consideration, regardless of the geographic location of production or the complex, obfuscating nature of transnational business operations. When we consider the broader, systemic implications of the Daewisa case, we are forced to acknowledge the deliberate, calculated nature of the trap that Kill Soo Lee constructed. He did not merely utilize the existing loopholes of the territory, he actively, expertly weaponized them. By selecting American Samoa, he exploited a jurisdictional void where the oversight of mainland labor standards was often treated as an abstract, distant mandate rather than a direct, daily reality. This geographic detachment allowed for the systematic, uninhibited creation of a total environment of control, a microcosm where the legal status of the workers was inverted, turning them from protected employees into captive hostages. The lesson of this exploitation is clear and haunting. Whenever the mechanisms of production are intentionally removed from the sphere of public, regulatory, and humanitarian scrutiny, the potential for catastrophic abuse grows exponentially. The case highlighted an urgent, critical need for a paradigm shift in how we approach global labor regulations. It demonstrated that we can no longer rely on the passive, often reactive enforcement of national standards, but must instead demand a proactive, universal framework of accountability that follows the product, the capital, and the employer, no matter how far they may venture from the reach of traditional oversight. The survivors, through the sheer force of their testimonies, proved that the invisible, abused, and silenced worker possesses an innate power to dismantle the most elaborate structures of oppression if given the opportunity to bear witness. Reflecting upon the aftermath of the trial and the subsequent passage of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, we see the tangible, lasting fruits of the survivors' courage. The legislation was not an abstract invention of politicians, but a direct, necessary response to the specific horrifying realities that these women were forced to live through daily. Every provision within the Act, every protection, every visa, every resource for victims, is a direct, living testament to the blood, the tears, and the immense collective strength of those who labored in the Daewisa factory. By enshrining these protections into law, the United States made a formal institutional commitment to never again allow such a systemic, massive-scale exploitation to occur in the shadows of its jurisdiction. The legacy of the survivors is therefore integrated into the very fabric of the legal system, serving as a permanent, active barrier against the return of the conditions they endured. This is the ultimate, profound reversal of fortune. The women who were once discarded as disposable, invisible, and utterly powerless became the architects of a legal structure that now provides a shield of protection for thousands of other individuals across the nation. Their lives, though scarred and forever marked by the trauma of their captivity, have become the instruments of a lasting, systemic, and vital public good. However, we must also approach the reflection of this case with a necessary, grounded candor. While the Daiwusa trial was a historic victory for justice, it also highlighted the enduring, persistent challenges that remain in the global fight against human trafficking. Even with improved laws and heightened international awareness, the fundamental systemic drivers of exploitation, poverty, desperation, the lack of viable employment, and the predatory transnational networks of traffickers continue to operate in every corner of the world. The Daiwusa case was one instance where the light was successfully shown into the darkness, and where the justice system acted decisively to provide a remedy. But for every such case that reaches a federal courtroom, there are undoubtedly countless others that continue to unfold in secret, far from the reach of investigation, the support of humanitarian agencies, or the intervention of law. The tragedy of Daiwusa, then, must be understood not as a resolved, finished chapter of history, but as an ongoing, urgent, and vital mandate for vigilance. It challenges us to remain profoundly, consistently skeptical of supply chains that promise low-cost production, while simultaneously obscuring the actual, human conditions of their labor force. It demands that we, as global citizens, maintain an active, unyielding concern for the realities of migrant workers, ensuring that their vulnerability is never again weaponized for the sake of profit. In the final analysis, the story of the women of Daiwusa is a narrative of profound, human resilience in the face of absolute, systemic inhumanity. It is a story that refuses to be forgotten, that demands to be told with gravity, and that serves as a cornerstone of our modern understanding of the battle for human rights. The image of those women standing in the federal courtroom in Hawaii, finally empowered to speak their truth after years of forced silence, remains one of the most powerful, definitive moments in the contemporary struggle for justice. They were not merely victims who survived, they were witnesses who convicted, and in doing so, they became the agents of their own and others' liberation. Their experience serves as a perpetual, necessary check on the arrogance of power, a reminder that the institutions of the law can indeed work to protect the vulnerable, but only when fueled by the courage of those who are willing to demand that their dignity be recognized and upheld. The legacy of Daiwusa is a permanent, ethical imperative. It forces us to recognize that our economic prosperity and our corporate practices cannot be untethered from our fundamental, human obligations. We are collectively responsible for the conditions under which the goods we consume are created, and we are accountable for ensuring that the global economy does not rest upon the suffering of the most vulnerable. As we look toward the future, the lessons of this tragic episode must remain a core, guiding principle of our social and legal consciousness. The Daiwusa factory, once a site of horrific exploitation, now exists as a symbol of the triumph of human agency over systemic, predatory greed. The survivors who were once stripped of everything, their identities, their labor, their dignity, and their hope, have successfully reclaimed their lives and in the process, have reshaped the legal landscape for the benefit of all. Their story is a testament to the fact that while the systems of oppression can be incredibly powerful, complex, and seemingly inescapable, they are never absolute. They are built by human hands and they can, with enough courage, resolve, and collective effort, be dismantled by human hands. The blood that stained the textile floor of the Daiwusa factory will never be entirely erased, but it has been transformed into a powerful, indelible mark on our history, a warning of what happens when we abandon our moral responsibilities, and a clear, unwavering indicator of the path toward a more just, humane, and protective future. The final legacy of the Daiwusa case is a silent, enduring oath taken on behalf of every worker who remains in the shadows, that we will never again permit their suffering to go unseen, their voices to be silenced, or their humanity to be sacrificed on the altar of the relentless, untaxed, and immoral pursuit of corporate profit. This is the promise that the survivors of Daiwusa extracted from history, and it is a promise that we must, at all costs, continue to honor. Through their immense collective endurance, they have ensured that their suffering was not in vain, and that the modern world is now better, more informed, and more fundamentally equipped to defend the sanctity of the individual against the most destructive, systemic, and predatory forces of the globalized industrial economy. The case of the Daewoo workers will remain a foundational, essential, and highly sobering pillar of our collective understanding of justice, a reminder that the price of our prosperity must never, under any circumstances, be paid in the currency of human lives. As we conclude this account, we are left with the final enduring image of those courageous women who, by their simple act of standing for the truth, successfully altered the course of history, and in doing so offered a profound, lasting gift of protection to countless others who will follow in their path. Their story is a light that continues to shine, a guiding, essential presence in our ongoing, collective journey toward a world where justice is not merely a legal aspiration, but the foundational, lived reality for every individual who works, strives, and contributes to the global community. The echoes of the Daewoo tragedy do not merely fade into the annals of legal history. They resonate as a fundamental, ongoing challenge to the global structures of power, accountability, and industrial ethics. When we contemplate the conclusion of this harrowing saga, we are not simply looking at a closed criminal file, but rather at the ignition point of a necessary, global transformation in how we perceive the relationship between labor, capital, and the state. The survivors, through their extraordinary resilience, did not just seek personal justice. They fundamentally altered the landscape of human rights advocacy, forcing a permanent shift in how corporate entities are expected to manage their supply chains. The reality they were forced to endure, a reality of systematic starvation, physical trauma, and forced labor, has become the modern benchmark for what must never be allowed to replicate, a baseline of atrocity that dictates the intensity and scope of current regulatory efforts. The legacy of their struggle is not static. It is a living, evolving mandate that demands constant, proactive engagement from every level of society, from the individual consumer to the highest reaches of international governance. It serves as a persistent, sobering reminder that the mechanisms of exploitation are highly adaptive, and that the vigilance required to counter them must be equally, if not more, robust. The case further illuminates the critical, precarious intersection between local jurisdictional autonomy and the universal, non-negotiable application of fundamental human rights. The fact that such a blatant, massive violation occurred within an American territory, thousands of miles from the mainland, is a testament to the dangers of administrative, geographic, and regulatory fragmentation. It underscores the undeniable necessity for unified, assertive oversight in every corner of a nation's jurisdiction, regardless of its distance or its level of political incorporation. We must recognize that the creation of jurisdictional gray zones, spaces where the rule of law is perceived as optional, distant, or subject to local compromise, inevitably invites the predators of the world to establish their fortresses of exploitation. The Daewoo facility was not a localized anomaly. It was a strategically placed entity designed to weaponize distance. By preventing this from ever happening again, we must adopt an integrated, comprehensive approach to human rights that ensures the legal standards of the mainland are strictly, invariably applied to every individual laboring under the national flag. This is not merely a legal or administrative preference. It is an ethical imperative that ensures the sovereignty of the law is not compromised by the convenience of distance. Moreover, the Daewoo case forces a deep, uncomfortable reevaluation of the role of the consumer within the globalized industrial supply chain. In our interconnected modern world, the products we use daily are often the result of complex, opaque processes that stretch across continents, cultures, and legal environments. We are too often divorced from the realities of the labor that creates these goods, allowing the comforting artificial distance between the point of production and the point of consumption to shield us from the human cost. The tragedy of the Daewoo factory shatters this distance, making it impossible to ignore the direct, visceral link between the low-cost apparel on a retail rack and the suffering of the individuals who stitched it in the heat of a Pacific island. This case challenges us to demand radical transparency, to question the origin of our products, and to advocate for supply chains that are built upon the pillars of transparency, fair compensation, and the absolute, unwavering protection of worker safety. It transforms the act of consumption into an act of moral consequence, placing the burden of responsibility not just on the regulators and the corporations, but also on the individuals who support the systems that, when left unchecked, can lead to such profound human misery. The survivor's journey also serves as a testament to the transformative power of agency in the face of absolute, systemic subjugation. They were treated as commodities, as disposable items in a production equation, yet they refused to be defined by that treatment. Their act of smuggling the SOS plea, their decision to testify in a federal court, and their commitment to building new lives on the mainland represent the highest, most profound expression of human agency. They reclaimed the humanity that was so brutally denied to them, and in doing so they provided a mirror to the world, reflecting the capacity for immense, individual courage, even when the machinery of oppression seems insurmountable. Their story encourages a more proactive, empowering approach to victim support, one that prioritizes the empowerment of survivors to become the leading voices in their own advocacy. It moves us away from a paternalistic, passive model of relief toward one that recognizes the survivors of human trafficking as the true experts and the most essential, authoritative partners in the development of solutions. Their voice is the most important element in the discourse, and it is a voice that must be heard, amplified, and respected as the central driver of systemic change. As we look toward the future, we must carry the memory of the Daiwusa workers as a permanent, active component of our commitment to a more just and humane world. We are living in an era where the pressures of global competition, the speed of industrial turnover, and the fluidity of capital often seem to move faster than the progress of human rights. But the story of these women proves that these trends are not inevitable. They are subject to the influence of human action, to the power of the law, and to the persistence of the global community's moral consciousness. The fight against modern-day slavery is an ongoing, daily struggle that requires the participation of every generation. It is a struggle that is won not through broad idealistic declarations alone, but through the hard, detailed, and often tedious work of legal reform, diligent monitoring, and the relentless advocacy for the vulnerable. The Daiwusa case stands as a monument to this reality, a case that took the abstract, distant, and often ignored problem of human trafficking and gave it a name, a location, and a human face. It ensures that we can never again plead ignorance of the suffering that occurs in the shadows of our economy, and it provides a clear, unwavering indicator of the path we must continue to travel. Ultimately, the resolution of the Daiwusa tragedy is not found in the finality of the courtroom, but in the continued, collective commitment of society to honor the truth that these survivors fought so hard to reveal. It is found in our resolve to maintain a global economic order that values the dignity of the person above the efficiency of the profit margin. It is found in the continued, rigorous application of the laws they help to shape, and in the ongoing support for the programs that continue to provide shelter, education, and healing to the victims of trafficking worldwide. The women who were once trapped in that remote, suffocating factory are now the architects of a safer, more vigilant world, their lives and their testimonies serving as the bedrock for the protection of all who labor. We are left with a final, sobering realization. The humanity of others is a shared, universal responsibility, and our ability to protect that humanity is the true, defining measure of our progress as a global society. The Daiwusa case, in all its darkness and its eventual hard-won light, remains the essential foundational story of how we must choose to live, to work, and to protect the essential dignity of the human person, ensuring that the path forward is paved not with the suffering of the many, but with the shared, principled, and unwavering commitment to the freedom and safety of the individual, no matter where they may reside, no matter what they may produce, and no matter how isolated their existence may appear to the rest of the world. It is the story that calls us to act, to watch, and to protect, and it is a story that, in the very act of its retelling, continues to serve as an essential protective barrier against the return of the horrific, systemic abuses that once defined the life of the women in Pago Pago. The light of their courage continues to serve as an enduring, necessary, and vital beacon for all who seek a more just, humane, and dignified future for every member of the global workforce. The final chapter of this investigation into the Daiwusa tragedy requires us to contemplate the profound, philosophical implications of a struggle that bridged the gap between a remote Pacific island and the highest courts of the American federal justice system. To look back at the years following the closure of the Pago Pago compound is to witness a quiet, ongoing reclamation of selfhood by those who were once treated as industrial machinery. For the survivors, The path from the barbed wire fences to the relative safety of the mainland was not merely a physical displacement but a monumental psychological reconstruction. Each woman, having endured the absolute, systematic erasure of her personal identity, had to learn how to exist as an autonomous individual once again, to speak without the fear of retribution, to nourish herself without the guilt of survival, and to envision a future that was not constrained by the brutal geometry of debt and quota. Their presence in the mainland United States, their integration into local communities, and their continued resilience stand as an enduring, defiant testament to the human spirit's capacity to outlast even the most meticulously engineered conditions of despair. They have effectively transformed the landscape of their own trauma into a garden of reclaimed agency, proving that while their captors could steal their labor, their passports, and their dignity for a time, they could not ultimately extinguish the core, resilient flame of their humanity. Beyond the individual healing of the survivors, the systemic legacy of the Daewisa case continues to exert a profound, corrective influence on the mechanisms of international law and corporate governance. The investigation laid bare the specific vulnerabilities inherent in the globalization of production, particularly when such production is intentionally decentralized into territories that lack robust, independent oversight. It provided a clear, actionable blueprint for human rights organizations to follow, emphasizing the vital importance of grassroots, survivor-led advocacy in the legislative process. By demonstrating the absolute, catastrophic failure of self-regulation within a profit-driven model that is untethered from ethical accountability, the case provided the necessary momentum to force a global rethink of how supply chains should be monitored. It taught the world that the Made in USA label is not, in itself, a guarantee of ethical production. Rather, it is a marker that must be accompanied by the continuous, rigorous, and transparent enforcement of worker protections. This realization has led to an increased, systemic demand for corporate due diligence, pushing companies to take proactive responsibility for the conditions within every factory, every dormitory, and every recruitment office that contributes to their commercial success. The Daewisa case is now an essential, non-negotiable reference point for any serious discussion regarding the ethical dimensions of global trade, a case that reminds us that the human cost of a product is just as significant as its retail price. Furthermore, we must confront the uncomfortable, enduring reality that the forces that enabled Kill Soo Lee, the unchecked desire for capital, the exploitation of geographic distance, and the systemic marginalization of migrant workers, remain persistent features of the globalized industrial world. The Daewisa factory was one specific, localized explosion, but the conditions that fostered it, the desperation of impoverished populations and the predatory ambition of global actors, are widespread. The duty that we, as a global society, owe to the memory of the Pago Pago struggle is to treat the Daewisa case not as a completed, closed narrative, but as an active, ongoing warning. It mandates a commitment to the continuous, rigorous monitoring of labor migration flows, the strengthening of whistleblower protections, and the relentless pursuit of transparency in all facets of transnational commerce. It demands that we elevate the voices of the most vulnerable and prioritize their protection over the efficiency of our consumption. The legacy of the women who labored in Pago Pago is a standard of justice that we must continue to live up to, an ethical bar that has been raised by their suffering and their defiance. We are called upon to be the witnesses that they initially lacked, to provide the oversight that their captors sought to exclude, and to defend the inherent value of every human life against the cold, mechanical logic of exploitation. As we bring this comprehensive, 8-part exploration of the Daewisa tragedy to its conclusion, we must also acknowledge the role of the legal professionals, the investigators, the humanitarian volunteers, and the survivors who together constructed the pathway to justice. Theirs was a monumental collaborative effort that took years of painstaking, often thankless work to bring the facts into the light of the federal court. It required the navigation of complex jurisdictional hurdles, the cultivation of deep, trust-based relationships with terrified witnesses, and the strategic, fearless application of the law in the face of immense corporate and political pressure. Their success stands as a model for how the institutions of justice can be empowered to function at their best, acting as a true, decisive force for the protection of the innocent and the accountability of the corrupt. This collaborative framework, the essential synergy between survivor testimony, expert legal advocacy, and the firm, unwavering application of the law, is the only viable strategy for dismantling the entrenched, highly adaptive networks of human trafficking that continue to operate globally. We are reminded that justice is not an automatic, self-executing process. It is a profound active achievement that requires the dedicated, courageous participation of individuals who are willing to stand against the tide of systemic indifference. The final lasting image of the Daewoo survivors is one of profound, quiet strength, a strength that has persisted despite the immense, scarring nature of their experience. They have moved through the crucible of their suffering and have emerged on the other side, not as mere remnants of a tragedy, but as the architects of a new, more vigilant, and more humane understanding of the world. They have given the world a gift of clarity, forcing us to look at the shadows of the global economy and to recognize the human faces that have been so often hidden from view. Their story is a beacon that continues to illuminate the path forward, ensuring that the progress we make in the defense of human rights is grounded in the reality of their suffering and the strength of their conviction. We must continue to share their story, to learn from their testimony, and to champion the principles of justice and human dignity that they fought so hard to reclaim. We honor their resilience by remaining vigilant, by questioning the systems that prioritize profit over people, and by dedicating ourselves to the creation of a world where every individual is recognized as the master of their own destiny, free from the threat of captivity, and protected by the fundamental, universal rights that define our humanity. The Daewoo factory may have been closed, the gates may have been dismantled, and the machinery may have been silenced, but the memory of those who suffered there will forever act as an essential, protective, and driving force in our collective journey toward a truly just, humane, and dignified future for every member of the global workforce. This history has been written for those who were silenced, for those who suffered, and for those who continue to struggle for their freedom in the shadows of the industrial world. It is a history that serves as a permanent active protest against the very idea that anyone can be bought, sold, or treated as less than the full sovereign human being they are. The survivors of Daewoo have taught us the most difficult, essential lesson of all, that the cost of justice is high, the work is arduous, and the struggle is long, but the result is a priceless, vital contribution to the collective welfare of our global society. Their courage is the foundation upon which we must build our future, a future that is anchored by the unwavering public acknowledgement of the dignity of every person who contributes to our economy, our world, and our shared humanity. As we close this account, we carry with us the solemn binding commitment to remain the watchful, active, and courageous guardians of that dignity, ensuring that the light of their truth never falters, never fades, and never allows the world to return to the darkness that they so bravely, and at such a profound personal cost, helped us to overcome. This is their final, lasting, and most important victory. They have ensured that the world can no longer look away, that the mechanisms of justice have been forever improved by their presence, and that the fundamental, inherent value of human life remains, above all else, the supreme, non-negotiable law of the modern age. May we always have the wisdom to listen to their voice, the courage to act upon their truth, and the unwavering resolve to ensure that their sacrifice leads, at last, to the definitive universal protection of every individual from the horrors of systemic exploitation. The Daewoo story is the story of our ongoing commitment to the truth, a story that remains and must forever remain, an active, essential part of our shared, evolving, and principled pursuit of a world where justice is not an exceptional event, but a universal, lived reality for all. The final, closing meditation on the Daewoo legacy demands that we step back from the specific details of the trial and the legislative aftermath to consider the broader, existential question of our collective responsibility as members of a globalized community. If the Daewoo tragedy represents the absolute nadir of human exploitation within a modern industrial framework, then the enduring commitment to remember, analyze, and apply the lessons of that suffering represents the highest potential of our moral development. The story of the more than 200 survivors who navigated the transition from the abyss of the Pago Pago compound to the relative stability of the mainland United States serves as a profound, multifaceted mirror for our contemporary era. It reflects not only the capabilities of our legal and humanitarian institutions, but also the persistent, often ignored weaknesses that allow the most vulnerable to be targeted by those who view human beings as expendable resources. By constantly revisiting this history, we are not merely performing an act of commemoration. We are engaged in an active, necessary exercise of social and ethical maintenance, ensuring that the critical, hard-won insights gained from the survivor's endurance remain at the forefront of our public consciousness. The survivor's journey teaches us that the protection of human rights is never a completed task, but an ongoing, iterative process that requires constant, vigilant attention to the changing, adaptive nature of global criminal enterprises and the shifting dynamics of the international labor market. When we consider the evolution of the global economy, we must confront the reality that the same forces of competition, the same relentless drive for cost reduction, and the same pursuit of jurisdictional advantage that fueled Kill Sue Lee remain potent, present realities. The potential for the emergence of new, equally sophisticated, and equally destructive forms of exploitation is a persistent, underlying threat that we must confront with unwavering proactive intelligence. This requires a fundamental structural change in how we evaluate the success of our economic models. We must move beyond the narrow, incomplete metrics of fiscal efficiency and industrial output to incorporate a rigorous, non-negotiable assessment of the human experience within those models. If a manufacturing or retail structure can only achieve its profitability through the erosion of human dignity, the systematic deprivation of basic needs, or the deliberate isolation of workers from their legal rights, then that structure is not an economic success. It is a moral and systemic failure that deserves to be dismantled. The Daiwusa case provides the definitive evidence for this conclusion, showing that such failures, when left unchecked, inevitably lead to trauma, to violence, and to the profound, irreversible degradation of the very individuals upon whose labor the entire operation depends. We must, therefore, hold our economic systems to the same standard of humanity that we hold our social systems, recognizing that there is no meaningful distinction between the two in the life of a worker. Furthermore, the Daiwusa narrative serves as a clarion call for the empowerment of migrant and temporary labor forces worldwide. The exploitation in Pago Pago was predicated on the intentional strategic disenfranchisement of workers who were distanced from their own cultures, their own legal protections, and their own communities. By systematically isolating them, Lee was able to manipulate their reality and enforce his own brutal rules of existence. To counter this, we must advocate for the development of international, standardized frameworks that ensure that a worker's rights remain constant, portable, and enforceable, regardless of where they are physically located. This means fostering greater transparency in international recruitment, providing workers with guaranteed access to independent legal representation, and creating secure, institutional pathways for the reporting of abuses without the threat of retaliatory deportation or financial ruin. The survivors of the Daiwusa factory, through their own painful experience, have demonstrated that the most effective, potent form of protection is the ability for a worker to know their rights, to exercise their agency, and to access the external authorities that can act as a check on local predatory power. We must prioritize these mechanisms in our international labor policies, ensuring that no worker is ever again placed in a position where they must choose between their physical survival and the ruin of their family. We must also reflect on the enduring transformative power of storytelling as a central component of human rights advocacy. The Daiwusa story did not gain its weight and its capacity for structural change in a vacuum. It gained it because the survivors were able to articulate their truth, because their stories were listened to, and because those stories were woven into the larger, compelling narrative of a struggle for justice. In an age of information overload, where the suffering of the distant or the invisible can be easily ignored, the intentional, empathetic retelling of human history remains one of our most effective tools for social change. By centering the experiences of the survivors, we move the conversation from the abstract to the concrete, from the systemic to the personal, and from the indifferent to the empathetic. This is the moral work that continues to sustain the Daiwusa legacy. The commitment to keep their truth alive, to ensure that their names, their hardships, and their triumph are not relegated to the footnotes of history, but are held as central, essential, and enlightening features of our contemporary understanding of the world. We owe it to the survivors to be the stewards of their truth, to amplify their voices in every venue where justice is discussed, and to continue the work of educating the world on the specific, brutal ways in which human life can be marginalized and the profound ways in which it can be reclaimed through the pursuit of truth. The journey we have taken through the history of the Daiwusa factory, from its dark industrial inception, through the horrific daily reality of the compound, to the hard-won justice of the federal trial, and finally to the long reconstructive process of recovery, has been a journey into the deepest, most troubling reaches of our collective humanity. Yet, it has also been a journey that has ultimately reinforced the fundamental, enduring value of the individual. In the face of a man who sought to reduce human beings to the value of their output, we have seen the triumph of the individuals who refuse to be reduced. They have shown us that even in the most profoundly dehumanizing conditions, the capacity for resistance, for truth, and for moral clarity remains. This is the ultimate, final, and most essential lesson of the Daewoo saga, that our dignity is not something that can be given or taken by a corporation or a factory manager. It is an inherent, non-negotiable, and permanent quality of our existence that can be obscured, that can be challenged, and that can be denied, but that cannot, ultimately, be erased. The survivors of Pago Pago have demonstrated this truth through their own lived experience, and they have, in the process, ensured that our world is better equipped to recognize, to protect, and to uphold that dignity in every context, every industry, and every corner of our shared interconnected reality. As we bring this comprehensive, exhaustive, and somber examination to its end, we do so with a renewed sense of purpose and a profound, solemn recognition of the responsibilities that come with the knowledge of such history. We are not the same people who began this account. We have been changed by the testimony of the women who labored in the dark, and we have been moved by the persistence of their search for justice. We carry their legacy with us, an enduring active piece of knowledge that now informs our understanding of the world, our evaluation of the products we use, and our commitment to the individuals who make them. The Daewoo factory stands as a permanent, silent monument to a failure of our collective morality, but the survivors stand as a living, vibrant monument to our capacity for reclamation, for truth, and for the persistent, necessary pursuit of a justice that transcends the limitations of our previous, fragmented understanding. Let this history be the firm, unyielding foundation upon which we continue to build a future where the exploitation of the human person is not a tolerated, invisible, or ignored feature of the economy, but is once and for all recognized as the most fundamental, prohibited, and universally rejected transgression of our shared global values. This is the promise of the survivors, this is the imperative of our history, and this is the enduring essential work that we must continue to do together, as the guardians of the truth and the protectors of the fundamental, inherent, and non-negotiable dignity of every human being everywhere. The light that the survivors lit in that courtroom is a light that must never be allowed to extinguish, for it is the light that continues to guide us through the complex, often shadowed landscape of our modern age, toward the realization of a more just, humane, and fundamentally protective reality for all who contribute their labor, their lives, and their essential human worth to our global community. The story of Daewoo remains an active, essential part of our moral life, a truth that must be carried forward with the same courage, the same commitment, and the same unyielding dedication that the survivors displayed when they first stood to speak the truth, finally and irreversibly, to a world that was, at last, compelled to listen, to witness, and to act. The culmination of our journey through the harrowing history of the Daewoo tragedy brings us to a final, profound synthesis of the lessons learned and the responsibilities inherited. To stand at this juncture is to acknowledge that the narrative we have traced, from the cold, calculated manipulation of the Pago Pago labor market to the historic, decisive victory within the halls of the federal judiciary, is not merely a historical record of individual suffering. It is, fundamentally, a definitive map of the inherent risks that accompany the pursuit of globalized capital when it operates without the necessary, non-negotiable anchor of universal human rights. The story of these survivors is a complex, multifaceted mosaic of human endurance, institutional failure, and the eventual necessary triumph of the rule of law. It forces us to reconcile the reality of our own participation in the global marketplace with the human costs that are frequently buried beneath the surface of retail convenience. We have explored the mechanics of their captivity, the visceral, documented reality of their physical and psychological assault, and the immense collective strength it took for these women to break the silence and demand the accountability that was their absolute, fundamental right. This legacy, as we have articulated, now belongs to the entirety of the global community, acting as an active, living guardrail against the return of such systemic, industrial-scale dehumanization. As we move forward, the most vital application of these lessons lies in the ongoing, rigorous, and proactive transformation of our international labor frameworks. We have seen, with devastating clarity, the consequences of allowing jurisdictional gray zones to persist within the shadow of national oversight. The Daiwusa case serves as a permanent, cautionary beacon that underscores the necessity for absolute, transparent, and portable worker protections. The future of global labor regulation must prioritize the empowerment of the worker, ensuring that they possess not only the knowledge of their rights but also the institutional, direct, and unhindered capacity to seek immediate, federal-level protection when those rights are violated. We must advocate for a model of governance that views the vulnerability of migrant labor not as a profit opportunity, but as a critical high-priority area for proactive, sustained protection and rigorous, unannounced oversight. The survivors of Daiwusa have effectively provided the policy blueprint for this transformation. Their struggle has highlighted the exact points of systemic weakness: the passport confiscation, the fabricated debt, the isolation, and the lack of accessible external oversight that must be the primary uncompromising targets of our future reform efforts. The protection of the vulnerable cannot be left to the arbitrary, unreliable benevolence of corporate actors. It must be an essential, non-negotiable function of the state and the international bodies that govern the movement of labor and capital. Furthermore, we must recognize that the ethical dimension of the economy is not a secondary, peripheral concern. It is the essential core measure of the economy's legitimacy. The Daiwusa factory was a highly productive, highly profitable entity, yet it was a fundamental systemic failure of the human and social order. This dichotomy, the separation of financial success from human well-being, is the central, most dangerous fallacy of the modern industrial age. By rejecting this fallacy, we commit ourselves to a new, higher standard of corporate and personal responsibility. We demand that the processes of production, the supply chains that connect us, and the companies that benefit from our participation are held to a rigorous, transparent standard that prioritizes the dignity of the individual worker above all other considerations. This is not a radical or impractical demand. It is the basic, necessary condition for a functioning, humane global society. The history of the Pago Pago compound serves as our definitive proof of what happens when we abandon this standard, and it provides the moral imperative for why we must, with absolute, unwavering resolve, insist upon its universal, strict application moving forward. We are the ultimate, collective arbiters of the systems that we participate in, and it is our ongoing duty to ensure that those systems operate in accordance with the values we hold to be fundamental and non-negotiable. The narrative of these courageous women, who transformed their own victimization into a powerful instrument of social and legal change, remains the most potent, essential evidence we possess of the necessity of our own engagement. They did not just suffer, they acted. They did not just endure, they resisted. They did not just survive. They fundamentally altered the course of history for thousands of others who will never know their names, but who are protected by the very laws and the very precedents that their struggle helped to forge. This is the greatest, most enduring, and most profound victory of the Daiwusa case. The realization that individual agency, when combined with the persistence of truth, can overcome the most entrenched, systemic, and predatory power structures. It is a lesson that should embolden every individual who finds themselves within an environment of abuse or exploitation to seek the support, the solidarity, and the external justice that they are fundamentally owed. It is a lesson that serves as a permanent, active rejection of the idea that any human life is disposable, and it stands as a clear, unwavering indicator of the collective moral duty we have to defend the inherent value of every human life against the cold, industrial logic of exploitation, no matter where it may occur, no matter how obscured it may be, and no matter how insurmountable it may seem. As we conclude this extended, 10-part examination, we carry with us the weight and the clarity of the truth that has been revealed. We are not just closing a chapter of history. We are affirming our ongoing, active commitment to the principles that these survivors fought for. We acknowledge that the memory of the Pago Pago compound is a shared, essential part of our modern, global consciousness, a memory that informs our decisions, challenges our assumptions, and guides our collective movement toward a more just, humane, and fundamentally protective reality. The story of these workers will remain a foundational pillar of our shared commitment to human rights, serving as a permanent, active reminder that we are all, in our own interconnected ways, the guardians of the dignity of others. We walk away from this account with a deeper, more profound, and more urgent sense of our obligation to remain vigilant, to remain engaged, and to remain fundamentally committed to the absolute, non-negotiable protection of every individual within our globalized industrial economy. The history of the women of Daewoo is a history that belongs to us all, and it is a history that must continue to inspire, to inform, and to drive our ongoing principled pursuit of a world where justice is not a distant, rare or hard-won privilege, but the fundamental, lived, and universally guaranteed reality for every human being everywhere. This account is our collective final act of bearing witness to the truth that they fought to establish. It is the fulfillment of the promise that their suffering would not be ignored, that their voices would not be silenced, and that their struggle would not be forgotten. We commit ourselves once and for all to the path of justice that they have so clearly and so bravely illuminated for us. We do this not only for the sake of the survivors of Pago Pago but for the sake of the dignity of the global labor force, for the sake of the future of the human rights movement, and for the sake of the very integrity of the societies in which we live. The legacy of Daewoo is the light of truth that we now carry, a light that we must ensure never falters, never fades, and never allows the darkness of industrial-scale exploitation to return to the shadows from which it was so decisively, and at such an immense personal cost, cast out. Our shared, permanent and essential mission is to ensure that the memory of these women serves as a constant active barrier against the return of the horrific systemic abuses that once defined their reality, transforming their story into a lasting protective barrier that ensures the inherent value of human life remains, forever, the absolute, foundational and non-negotiable priority of our modern age. This is the final, essential and most enduring truth that we take from this saga. The human spirit, when joined with the pursuit of justice, is a power that can at last dismantle the fortresses of exploitation and open the path toward a future that is, truly and fundamentally, defined by the protection, the honor and the dignity of every person who contributes to our shared, global human experience. In this, the women of Pago Pago have won the ultimate victory, and in this we have found our own lasting and essential commitment to the future of our collective humanity. The 11th and final part of this extended narrative serves as the ultimate resolution and enduring philosophical testament to the Daewoo tragedy, bringing the story into the contemporary context of the year 2026. Looking back at the decades that have unfolded since the closure of the Pago Pago factory, we find that the echoes of that suffering have become woven into the very fabric of global human rights discourse. The survivors, many of whom have now built new lives in the United States, serve as a living link between a dark, industrial past and an increasingly vigilant future. Their journey, which began in the rural provinces of Vietnam and China and crossed the treacherous landscape of modern-day slavery, has ultimately arrived at a place of advocacy, education, and reflection. They have transitioned from being the involuntary participants in a failed experiment of predatory capitalism to becoming the deliberate, influential voices of a movement dedicated to the protection of labor dignity. The impact of their testimony cannot be overstated. It has fundamentally challenged the moral complacency that often characterizes the consumption habits of the modern world. By insisting that their story be heard, they have ensured that the anonymous, invisible labor that sustains our global economy is no longer truly invisible, and they have demanded that the ethics of production be placed on an equal, if not superior, footing to the ethics of fiscal profit. The structural changes that have occurred in the wake of the Daewoo case reflect a broader, global shift toward the increased institutionalization of corporate accountability. While the tragedy itself was a specific, localized disaster, the response it catalyzed has had international repercussions. The integration of stringent supply chain auditing standards, the development of corporate social responsibility frameworks that are legally binding rather than merely aspirational, and the continuous refinement of international anti-trafficking legislation. All of these elements owe a profound, historic debt to the survivors who refused to be silenced. We have entered an era where the concept of the global citizen now explicitly includes the responsibility to act as a witness to the conditions of the distant laborer. This evolution in our public consciousness is the most significant, structural victory of the Daewoo struggle. It has replaced the passive indifference of the late 90s with a more active, critical awareness that recognizes the interconnectedness of our global choices. The tragedy has functioned as a massive corrective mirror, forcing the world to look at the mechanisms of its own convenience and to realize that the price of our material prosperity can never, under any circumstances, be paid through the systematic dehumanization of another person. Furthermore, we must address the persistent, ongoing challenges that continue to define the landscape of global labor in the current year. Despite the immense progress made since the Daewoo era, the predatory impulses that Kill Soo Lee once channeled remain inherently, dangerously present. The digital age, with its rapid, globalized logistics and its ability to mask the true origins of products through complex, layered subcontracting, has provided new sophisticated tools for those who seek to exploit the vulnerable. We are now tasked with the responsibility of applying the lessons of Pago Pago to the new digital frontiers of labor exploitation. This means demanding not only physical transparency in our factories but digital transparency in our supply chains, using the tools of technology to monitor, verify, and guarantee the humane conditions of labor across every link of the production chain. The legacy of Daewoo demands that we be as innovative, as fast, and as determined as the traffickers themselves, ensuring that our oversight remains a step ahead of those who would see the freedom and safety of the human person as merely another variable to be optimized for profit. The survivor's history is our most effective, essential manual for this ongoing struggle, providing the ethical, legal, and human-centric framework that must continue to guide our efforts in an increasingly complex world. The role of the survivor advocate has emerged as the most critical element in this ongoing movement. By elevating the voices of those who have personally navigated the darkest reaches of the industrial economy, we ensure that our policies remain grounded in the reality of human experience, rather than the abstractions of legal theory. The survivors of Daewoo have demonstrated that there is no substitute for the raw, undeniable authority of the lived experience. Their ability to articulate the precise mechanics of their subjugation, the psychological manipulation, the strategic isolation, the calculated deprivation, has provided the data, the focus, and the emotional force required to fuel decades of legislative and corporate change. We must continue to support, protect, and amplify these voices, recognizing that they are the primary architects of our most successful human rights interventions. Their ongoing advocacy is the pulse of the movement, the persistent, essential rhythm that reminds us that this is not a battle to be fought in the abstract, but a battle for the physical, psychological, and existential dignity of individuals who are living, striving, and hoping for a better life. The victory of the Daewoo survivors is not merely that they survived, but that they have ensured that the mechanisms of their own rescue are now permanently, integrally available to others. Reflecting on the role of the federal justice system in this case, we see a powerful historic demonstration of what can be accomplished when the law is applied with absolute, non-negotiable integrity. The federal court in Hawaii, by refusing to defer to local jurisdictional pressures, and by asserting the full authoritative reach of American law, transformed the Daewoo case into a landmark precedent. It established the principle that human rights violations occurring within the territorial scope of the United States, or orchestrated by those operating under the cover of United States labels, are subject to the highest, most stringent levels of federal review and penalty. This is a foundational, essential pillar of our legal system, a pillar that we must continuously defend, expand, and enforce. The Daewoo case stands as the definitive, documented proof of the necessity of this federal oversight, showing that local or territorial exceptions to the rule of law are, in practice, invitations to the most horrific systemic failures of human protection. As we move forward into the future, we must ensure that this principle remains central, inviolable, and always ready to be invoked, ensuring that there is no corner of our legal world where human dignity can be ignored, compromised, or discarded. In the final contemplative moments of this 11-part journey, we recognize that the Daewoo legacy is, at its heart, a commitment to the fundamental, non-negotiable value of the human being. The story of those more than 200 women is a permanent, indelible part of our shared history, a narrative that has shaped the modern world's understanding of its own moral obligations. We have seen how the darkness of the compound in Pago Pago was transformed, through the persistence of truth and the authority of justice, into a light that now illuminates the path for the entire global community. This is the triumph of the human spirit, a victory that does not belong to any one person, any one nation, or any one generation, but to the collective conscience of humanity. We leave this account with the solemn, binding promise that we will carry the truth of their suffering and the strength of their victory with us into the future. We promise to remain the guardians of their story, to act as the stewards of the legislative changes they help to ignite, and to ensure that the dignity of every person who contributes their labor to our global economy is recognized, upheld, and defended with the same courage that these survivors displayed when they first stood before the world to demand their freedom. Their journey, once defined by the barbed wire of a Pacific enclosure, now spans the entire global community, serving as an enduring, active, and essential reminder that justice is the supreme, necessary, and ultimate achievement of a truly humane and civilized world. As we conclude this profound, exhaustive, and deeply necessary examination of the Daiwissa factory and the lives of those who suffered within its walls, we recognize that the story is now ours to carry. It has been transformed from their private, traumatic nightmare into our collective, shared, and public history. We are tasked with the ongoing work of ensuring that this history continues to inform, to challenge, and to inspire our pursuit of a world where justice is not a distant theoretical goal, but a living day-to-day reality. The survivors of Daiwissa have given us everything: their memories, their pain, their endurance, and their truth, and in return we give them our commitment. The commitment to never look away, to never accept the ease of convenience over the demands of justice, and to ensure that the light of their victory continues to shine, guiding us, protecting us, and strengthening our resolve for every generation that will follow. This is the ultimate, final, and most essential truth of the Daiwissa experience. The human person is not a disposable industrial component, but the absolute, foundational, and non-negotiable center of all that we value, all that we build, and all that we strive for in this world. In this, the survivors have achieved the greatest, most enduring, and most significant victory of all, a victory that will echo through the halls of history as long as there are those who remember, those who witness, and those who remain fundamentally, unshakably committed to the protection of human dignity in all its forms. Their story is the story of our ongoing commitment to a justice that transcends the boundaries of geography, the limitations of our past, and the indifference of the present, leading us toward the creation of a future that is truly defined by the safety, the honor, and the dignity of every single human being who labors in our global community. The light of their courage is now our collective inheritance, and we must ensure that it burns bright, for it is the light of the future, the light of justice, and the light of our shared, evolving, and essential commitment to the protection of the inherent value of the human being, a mission that we now finally and definitively embrace as our own.